Hello everyone. Today we'll be covering our primer presentation topic of how a sports journalist should cover high school sports. Today's information will be presented to you by Marya Cunningham, myself, Drew Best, Alyssa Brooks, and Ashlyn Oren. The topics that we will cover today include statistics and whether or not they're helpful or harmful, as presented by Alyssa, setting yourself up for success in sports journalism, as presented by Ashlyn, advice for the in-game experience, as presented by myself, and asking the right questions after the games, as presented by Marya.
Let's start with a question about using statistics. Is it helpful or harmful to the article being written? It's different in high school compared to a professional sport because high schools have lower budgets. Professional sports have better access to and has more professional equipment. The use of statistics are beneficial to an article, especially at the high school level, but mixing in other aspects like comparing matchups and other analysis will always be more beneficial and give the content life. But if the article relies solely on statistics, and there's an excessive amount of them, then the readers may get bored. There needs to be an angle approach with the lack of content already given at the high school level. Being observant is important when preparing for a story. Things to watch for are looking for a hidden talent on the court or the baseball diamond, or watching for a player's body language while they're up against a rival opponent, or how they're standing when there's a conflict going on the field. Research is key. There are a variety of high school sports to cover, so it's important to become familiar with the different statistics each sport offers. As a journalist, having a deeper understanding of stats will become beneficial to the article and a person's reputation, more so the one writing the article. If the wrong statistics are used, readers will pick up on that and won't want to read any of the content. To aid in a journalist's research, there are different websites that showcase high school sports. In Wisconsin, there's Max Preps, but there are different sites depending on the state and location. Not knowing stats is unprofessional, especially early on in a journalist's career. That can be detrimental, especially at the high school level, whether they're covering a newspaper, the high school themselves. That's why at the high school level, that is a true test for a journalist. A journalist who is covering high school sports is a jack of all trades per se. They have to do research, keep stats during the game, and maintain relationships with coaches, athletes, and the athletic director, and parents, absolutely. Covering high school sports can be a challenge because of all the extra work that needs to be done on top of pleasing the readers, just like the parents. Being prepared and knowing an overhaul of information is better than being unprepared and doing everything on the fly. Paying close attention to the action and being prepared with materials beforehand will be most beneficial to the journalist. Establishing yourself. The sports journalist job market has a low demand but is a very competitive market to get in. The market is supposed to grow 3.4% by 2026. As a sports journalist, especially covering high school sports, a journalist may be freelance and make do with what they have. Building creative avenues for popular sports like high school football builds up the journalist's reputation to become a well-liked individual in the community. Other avenues like social media posts, showcasing photos, and creating interactions with the school's sports pages will give more traction to the journalist page and boost viewership. Being creative to stand out. While covering high school sports, there are fewer media outlets in comparison to professional sports. While covering high school sports, the journalist is more than likely working for a newspaper, a blog writer, or a voice for a radio station in some cases. Using data analysis as a creative tool for interviews will set you apart from the other content that's being put out by the other writers in the area that are covering the same game. So picking up on small details during the game and especially finding an angle approach is what will be most beneficial to the content being put out. Being observant during a game and picking up on different cues can be used for more detailed content in a game analysis, like I just said. This quote is pretty spot on for reporters like us that are just starting. For young reporters, especially in this age and into the future, the ability to give people information they can't get anywhere else, to give something that's unique and different, that's what will separate you. I don't know that there's anything more important than that right now, said ESPN Insider.
Once you're hired as a prep writer, there are multiple ways to set yourself up for success. Introducing yourself is one of the most important things you can do. Collecting contact information at the first meeting oftentimes will create a relationship with the coaches or ADs, and they'll give you their personal phone number or a way to get in contact the quickest. A brief phone call or face-to-face meeting allows you to stick out from the crowd. This personal touch of introducing yourself has now created a faster response window, helping you meet those quick deadlines. Preparing for high school sports days in advance is necessary. Not all schools have paper rosters available at the front door anymore. Do your research and avoid unnecessary confusion about which Johnson is which on the court. School secretaries, athletic directors, and coaches can give this information to you if you ask for it. High school state websites are also your friend. They provide rosters, stats, and next opponents even. Some schools will use Max Preps, others will use their state websites. For example, Wisconsin uses wisports.net. It's full of statistics, standings, and scores. Contacting coaches and athletic directors about interviews before games is also very important. High school sports are different than college. Most coaches have jobs beyond just being a high school coach. Setting up times for interviews before game day is important in securing your spot for post or pregame intel. Not all schools are equipped with facilities for the media, and reporters regularly are forced to write by light in cars and bathrooms and in other on-campus rooms away from fields and gymnasiums, which already cuts into limited writing time. For high school sports, you get what you get. It's important to understand that for high school sports, the media is not always their biggest worry. In-season games will more than likely be a little less crowded. A journalist will have to prepare the best they can for late-night games, post-game interviews, and even a crowded gym once in a while. Postseason games will likely be crowded. Prepare to get there before anyone else, and be prepared for others covering postseason games as well. Claim your spot next to the action, and setting up interviews ahead of time will again allow you to beat the crowd. Now, covering all sports can create a wider audience for you. While it can be fun to cover the most popular sports like basketball or Friday night football games, sports like wrestling, cross country, and lacrosse also need coverage too. People will appreciate this coverage more than you think. Looking for sports that typically have limited coverage will allow you to build wider online and print media. Wider audience will also create more attention to other stories you'll put out. Reporting high school sports is expanding as time goes on, so developing this audience now can set you up for the future. To attract an even wider online audience, social media is important. Announcing that you're at the high school to watch tonight's game will allow for people who aren't able to make it to look out for live stats. Twitter is typically a great way to do this. The app sets you up for fast updates that everyone can read. Preparing a hashtag in advance that you will use will allow for your tweets to be found more easily. It could be for the game itself, for example, EHS versus WHS for the Edgerton versus Whitewater High School basketball game, or even a hashtag of the school you're covering for instance, EHS Sports. Using tags of players, coaches, or even if the school has a set account for the team also helps with attraction, and you should prepare these in advance to have on hand.
Once you are done with any prior research or analytics pertaining to an event, it's time to hit the road and cover the game or match in which you have been preparing for. This part is often misconceived by the typical journalist starting out, but there is a lot that goes into the journalist's job even at the high school level. there are plenty of misconceptions about how a journalist should do their job at sporting events. My name is Drew Best, and I'm here to present the best pieces of advice from journalists that help the most with in-game coverage. The first piece of advice for an in-game coverage of high school sports is to stay close to the action. Your experience with a sporting event will not be the same if you're sitting up in the press box. The communication between everyone in action on the field can be important, as well as influential to the way that you observe the game. If you are away from the action, writing about an important call, play, or interaction will not carry as much emotion or meaning when you write your piece later on. Another important reason to stay up close is so that you can observe the surrounding environment of fans, parents, and teammates. A prime example of this can come from football, Friday Night Lights. If you're standing sideline for a football game in high school, chances are there will be a ton of students in attendance, as well as many other families and alumni, and even coach versus referee conversations that you would not want to miss. They can help sway the energy of the game in many ways, which could be something to potentially take note of. Another important part of staying close to the action would be to keep track of the game metrics. This could mean live stats to many, but it could also more importantly be literal measurements. It helps to answer questions such as, did he reach the first down line? Did he step on the three-point line? Or did they go out of bounds on that play? Game metrics lead directly into another important piece of covering live high school sports, which is keeping updated stats of the game. Journalists who are able to keep track of these metrics that aren't typically observed by the casual fan are the ones whose understanding will improve comparatively better than interviews and analysis. In today's day and age, anyone with a smartphone can either download a live stats app or even have stats produced to them by statisticians at the game. However, if you can't gather access to online stats, you could still stick to pen and paper for keeping track of statistics at the game. For baseball, it's easy to keep live stats in a scorebook as pictured below. The next major step is social media. People who may not be able to make it to the game should be able to feel invested in the action as it is happening. So if a major play occurs in the game, if you can dish out that information as efficiently as possible to social media, that can help build your rep as a journalist and an impromptu writer. The last piece of this section would be to dig into advanced stats. Being able to pay attention to the stats that don't go on the scoreboard can help audiences retrieve a better understanding of that event. The last topic, and likely the most important piece of advice, is to remain an unbiased reporter. As stated by Tom McGarvey, a senior editor for WIWrestling.com, when in press row, we are professionals, and we need to appear somewhat neutral in our decorum the vast majority of the time of the event. What this means is that if you're sitting at a press table, especially if you're close to an event, no typical matchgoer will want to see someone acting as a fan of a certain team. That's not our place. When controversy strikes, journalists are advised not to take a side. Once you take notes on a controversy, Lisa Beckelheimer, a writer for the National Council of Teachers of English, in her essay titled Teaming Up, Teaching Analysis and Research Through Sports Controversies, advises that, unlike the traditional opinion-based research essay, the focus requires additional clarification and instruction in analysis. Instead, the claims that you are making about what is significant, important, and or troubling about the controversy itself. Lastly, it is important to interview both sides after the game. If you are interviewing the losing coach after a game, it is still important to speak as positively as you can on their performance, just as you would a winning coach. Covering both sides of a match takes away from the observable preference in a high school sporting event.
Hello everyone, my name is Marya Cunningham and this is my part of our high school sports presentation. Asking the right questions to teenage athletes is always very important. You want to be careful with how you contact the athletes and figure out the proper means to ask them questions. You don't want to come off as creepy or quote unquote bothersome, and you also don't want to make the athletes feel uncomfortable. You also want to encourage social media interactions with the athletes as well as have them post about their performances so other people can interact with them. A good way to correctly contact teenagers is to catch up with them after games. You normally want to do this, though, if you already contacted their parents or coaches ahead of time. This just helps the teenage athlete prepare and feel more comfortable for the interview. You can also set up side interviews through parents and coaches. Again, comfortability is the number one thing to focus on with teenage athletes. Texting is another okay option if you already have a relationship with the athletes. You normally don't want to text them first because it could come off as creepy, but if you do get their phone number from them or from their parents or coaches, this is normally okay because the athlete has already discussed it with them. Social media contact is kind of a last resort for initial contact because you don't want to come off like you're stalking their account and you're wanting to message them right away through this without talking to their parents and coaches. But again, if you do already have a relationship with them, this is an A-OK way to contact them. As we know, most teenagers and young adults live their lives through social media. As a journalist, you want to encourage athletes to post about themselves on their social media platforms, as well as interview them with a video and post that on your social media platforms. This can give students, college recruiters, fans, etc., a way to interact with athletes and vice versa. It also shows their personality as well as their honest answers to questions you have asked them. Brad Schultz and Mary Lou Sheffer from the University of Southern Mississippi did a study on how Twitter has become the main platform for young sports journalists. They called Twitter, quote, an instantaneous, interactive, intermedia conglomeration that seems to be continually redefining itself, end quote. They found that younger journalists are conforming to the new and growing usage of Twitter when it comes to sports journalism because they've been exposed most of their lives to social media platforms. They also found that older journalists still stick to older ways of reporting and that they believe that the fast growing use of social media is deleting the old ways. Finally, Schultz and Sheffer found that more studies need to be done on, quote, particular groups of sports journalists and their perceptions that new technologies are not only leading the profession in the wrong direction, but also killing off traditional methods and models. After obtaining information from your sources appropriately and comfortably, as well as encouraging social media interactions with athletes, you want to write your stories non critically. You need to understand things that teenagers say can come off as immature. You need to be non critical about missing plays, and you can also include what to write about if you run out of things to write about, such as trends, issues, and college sports, as well as play by play stories. Believe it or not, teenagers say immature things sometimes. I know, it's crazy to think about. It is a journalist's job to re-ask questions to teenage athletes to make sure that something they said is what they actually wanted to say. Teenagers like to joke around, be sarcastic, especially to authority figures, so re-asking questions to them allows them to answer in a more serious manner. If they do reply with the same joking answer they gave you before, you can jot it down, take notes, record it. As long as you give them a chance to answer more seriously, then it's okay. You also need to remember most teenagers are playing for fun and they are going to miss plays. Don't say that a kid choked it or blew it because they're still in their learning stages. Just make sure that if you do talk about a teenage athlete missing a play, you remain friendly and non biased. Sometimes in small towns you run out of stories to write. The audiences may be small for specific schools and towns, so they may become bored easily with the stories you write. This is why you want to write about trends and issues such as injuries, rule changes, facilities, etc. Like I mentioned, it keeps the audiences more interested and more likely to stick around and read more of your content. Some ideas to include trends and issues to your stories is to write feature stories about high performing athletes, to write about college recruiting, and to include play by play stories. Sometimes your stories are the only way people can get play by plays if they weren't physically at the game. So, most of the time, you want to do play by play stories, especially in small towns, because that is sometimes the only source of information that somebody can get for high school sports. We have covered a lot of information in this presentation, but we want to leave you with a few main points. One of the major points is you need to remember who you are interviewing and talking to, which is teenagers. They're going to be immature sometimes, say inappropriate things, but it is your job as a journalist to re-ask questions, to help guide them through the interviews, just to make sure that what they want to say is actually what they want to say. You also need to remember to be professional, but also have fun. Find what your passion is, but also know that readers, like parents, can be a bother, but you need to learn how to reason and respond to them in an appropriate and respectful way, even if they are not being respectful to you. And last thing, you need to be prepared and observant. Separate yourself from other media outlets and their content, and find creative ways to deliver the content you are presenting. Finally, we're going to leave you with a few discussion questions to think about. Number one, at what point are analytics over the top? Number two, in your opinion, what is the most important thing you can do to prepare for covering high school sports? Number three, according to Schultz and Sheffer, why do younger sports journalists conform to the use of Twitter and other social media outlets better/faster than older journalists? And number four, what are the best ways to approach and interview an athlete after a game/match as opposed to a coach?